It began with a phone call no one expected, and a silence that followed no one could explain. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Kensington Palace staff were summoned without explanation. Security protocols changed, doors were sealed, phones were confiscated. And somewhere inside those ancient walls, Prince William received information so devastating, so personal, that even the future king could not hide its weight. Within hours, Britain would learn that something irreversible had happened. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The palace had seen urgency before. It had weathered wars, scandals, and losses that reshaped the monarchy across generations. But this was different. The summons did not follow the familiar rhythm of controlled crisis. It came suddenly, cutting through the fragile calm of early morning, waking senior aides who had learned over decades to recognize the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe. This was catastrophe. There was no preamble, no warning, only a simple directive: report immediately. Those who received the message later described the tone as cold, stripped of the careful reassurance that usually accompanied royal disruptions. It was not designed to comfort. It was designed to move quickly, before questions could form. By the time the first vehicles arrived through the palace gates, something invisible had already shifted. Staff who normally carried themselves with quiet confidence moved with restrained urgency, avoiding eye contact, sensing that whatever had happened carried consequences that could not be undone. Inside, corridors that usually echoed with quiet routine now held an unnatural stillness. Conversations were brief and hushed. No one wanted to be the first to say what they feared. No one wanted to confirm that history was once again demanding its price. And at the center of it all was Prince William. He had not emerged from his private quarters. Breakfast remained untouched. Calls from trusted advisors went unanswered. For nearly 2 hours, he remained alone, behind doors that had always protected him but could no longer shield him from what he had just learned. Those closest to him would later say that isolation was not avoidance. It was necessity. Because in those 2 hours, William was not simply processing information. He was confronting the collapse of certainty. He was absorbing a truth that reached far beyond royal protocol and into the deepest, most human parts of himself. Catherine was inside the palace that morning, but she was not seen. Her absence from public view spoke louder than any appearance could have. She was where she needed to be beside him, anchoring him in a moment that threatened to pull everything apart. Those who understood their bond knew that her presence was not ceremonial. It was survival. She understood without explanation. She stood without hesitation. And in doing so, she became the quiet force holding him steady as the weight of tragedy settled onto his shoulders. Outside, security tightened with unusual intensity. Additional personnel arrived without announcement. Entry points were restricted. Movement was controlled. This was no longer simply a private matter. It had become something larger, something with implications that extended beyond family, beyond emotion, into the very structure of the monarchy itself. Staff noticed. They always noticed. And though no one spoke openly, the truth began to form in their minds. This was not temporary. This was not manageable. This was final. The whispers began carefully, as they always did. A family matter. A private loss. Words chosen to soften reality without denying it. But the tone betrayed the truth. This was not the kind of news that could be contained behind palace walls. It would escape. It would reach the public. And when it did, nothing would be the same. William's private secretary was among the few who had seen him that morning. When he emerged, his composure was intact, but his eyes revealed everything. He moved quickly, avoiding conversation, carrying the burden of knowledge that could not yet be shared. Those who saw him understood immediately. Something irreversible had happened. Something that would force William to step forward, not as the protected heir he had always been, but as the leader he had always been preparing to become. Even the communications office, trained to manage perception with surgical precision, found itself uncharacteristically silent. Scheduled appearances were quietly postponed. Public engagements disappeared from the calendar without explanation. The machinery of the monarchy, normally relentless in its consistency, had paused. It was waiting for William, waiting for the moment when private grief would become public truth. Because behind those sealed doors, beyond the controlled silence and guarded corridors, the emergency meeting itself, the one that would ultimately force William to deliver the most tragic news of his life, had already begun behind closed doors, and those present would never forget what they witnessed next. No cameras were allowed, no records were officially kept. And yet, what happened inside Kensington Palace that morning would alter the emotional foundation of the royal family forever. Senior advisors, legal authorities, and family representatives gathered around a single polished table. They weren't there to debate policy. They were there to confront a truth so painful that even centuries of royal tradition offered no protection from its consequences. The room itself became a place where time slowed, where every breath carried weight, and where the unspoken truth lingered heavier than anything that could be said aloud. These were not ordinary advisors. These were the individuals trusted with the monarchy's most fragile realities, the ones called only when the stakes involved permanence, when decisions could never be reversed. Their presence alone signaled the scale of what had happened. They had been summoned not because protocol required it, but because destiny had forced it. Each person understood the unspoken rule of that room: emotion must remain controlled, no matter how devastating the truth became. Legal representatives arrived quietly, carrying documents that had existed long before this morning but had never been expected to surface so soon. Their arrival confirmed what many had already begun to fear. This was not speculation. This was confirmation. This was final. The documents themselves represented more than legality, they represented consequence. Authority would shift. Responsibilities would change. And somewhere between ink and silence, the future of the royal family had already begun to rearrange itself. Prince William did not enter immediately. He allowed the room to settle into its tension, as if gathering strength from the quiet before stepping into it. When he finally appeared, those present immediately sensed the transformation already unfolding within him. He carried himself with composure, but it was not the effortless composure of routine duty. It was deliberate, chosen, built on determination rather than comfort. His eyes revealed exhaustion, but beneath that exhaustion lived something stronger: acceptance. He took his place without hesitation, not because he was ready, but because readiness was no longer relevant. This moment had chosen him. Catherine remained beside him, her silence louder than anything she could have said. She did not interrupt, she did not question. She understood that words would only weaken what William needed to hold together. Her strength was not expressed through authority, but through presence. Those who observed her that morning would later say she became his shield, absorbing the emotional pressure that threatened to overwhelm him. Together, without speaking, they formed a quiet alliance against the storm unfolding around them. The documents were presented carefully, their contents already understood but still impossible to fully accept. Advisors spoke in measured tones, balancing emotional sensitivity with institutional necessity. They discussed timing, they discussed impact, they discussed how the truth would be delivered to a world that expected strength, even when strength felt impossible. This was the burden of monarchy. Grief could exist, but it could never exist privately for long. And then something shifted. William spoke. His voice did not tremble. It did not hesitate. But it carried something far more powerful than confidence. It carried resolve. He did not ask whether he should deliver the news. He declared that he would. It was not simply a decision, it was a declaration of identity. In that moment, he was no longer just the heir. He was the protector of the crown's emotional truth. Those around him understood immediately. This was not obligation. This was transformation. For those present, the realization was undeniable. They were witnessing the quiet birth of a new kind of leadership, one forged not by ceremony, but by suffering. William was no longer being prepared for the future. He had stepped into it, not gradually, not ceremonially, but suddenly, completely, and without retreat. Yet even those inside the room could not fully grasp how deeply the news would fracture William, not just as a future monarch, but as a son, a brother, and a father facing an unthinkable reality. For decades, Prince William had prepared himself for loss. He had lived through tragedy before, but nothing not royal training, not emotional resilience, not the burden of destiny could prepare him for this moment. Because this time, the loss wasn't historical. It wasn't distant. It was immediate. It was personal. And it forced William to confront a truth he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. Inside that room, surrounded by individuals who represented continuity and control, William felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years' exposure. Not physical exposure, but emotional exposure. The kind that strips away preparation, strips away protocol, strips away even identity itself. Because for all the years he had spent becoming the future king, he had never stopped being the boy who learned too early that life inside palace walls did not guarantee protection from pain. That memory lived quietly within him, buried beneath responsibility and expectation. But now, without warning, it had returned. Loss had always been part of his story. It had shaped his silence, sharpened his instincts, and hardened his emotional discipline. He had learned to survive it, to carry it privately while presenting strength publicly. But this moment was different. This moment demanded more than survival. It demanded confrontation. It demanded that he stop outrunning the inevitability he had always known would come, that one day he would stand at the center of tragedy again, not as a witness, but as its messenger. The advisors continued speaking, but their words began to blur into fragments of meaning. Legal implications. Institutional continuity. Public stability. They spoke the language of monarchy, the language designed to contain emotional chaos within structured response. But William heard something deeper beneath those words. He heard finality. He heard the quiet collapse of a chapter that could never be rewritten. And for the first time since entering the room, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Beside him, Catherine remained steady. She did not interrupt the silence forming around him. She did not attempt to rescue him from it. She understood that this was something he had to face fully, without protection. But her presence gave him something equally powerful: permission to remain human. In her quiet strength, he found clarity. Not clarity of comfort, but clarity of purpose. She was not there to carry the burden for him. She was there to remind him that he could carry it and still endure. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, when hesitation entered his mind. The advisors had offered alternatives. Others could deliver the message. Others could shield him from the emotional exposure that would follow. It would have been easier. It would have been safer. But safety had never defined his path. And deep down, William understood something that no advisor could teach him, that leadership born from distance creates obedience, but leadership born from truth creates trust. He made his decision not out of obligation, but out of identity. If the monarchy was to endure, it could not hide behind silence. It had to speak through him. That realization changed him. Not visibly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because in choosing to deliver the news himself, William was not simply fulfilling duty. He was accepting emotional ownership of the crown's future. He was stepping beyond the protection of inheritance and into the vulnerability of leadership. And in doing so, he exposed not weakness, but courage, the kind of courage that cannot be inherited, only earned through suffering. Those around him recognized it immediately. The transformation was quiet, but unmistakable. He was no longer standing there as someone preparing for destiny. He was standing there as someone living it. And yet, the tragic truth William now carried was not his alone. It was a burden that would ripple through every corner of the royal family. The walls of Kensington Palace may have contained the meeting, but they could not contain its consequences. Within hours, word began to spread through private channels. Calls were made, messages were sent, and across royal residences, reactions ranged from stunned silence to quiet devastation. Because the news William now held did not belong to him alone, it belonged to an entire family already shaped by loss. The first calls were not ceremonial. They were personal, direct, unavoidable. Each one carried the same emotional gravity, the same quiet confirmation that something irreversible had entered their lives. There were no rehearsed statements, no protective layers of formal language. This was family speaking to family. And yet, even in those private exchanges, the weight of centuries lingered, shaping every word, every pause, every silence that followed. Because within this family, grief was never experienced in isolation. It was experienced as part of an institution that could not afford to break, even when its members felt shattered. Some received the news with immediate understanding. They did not ask questions. They did not resist the truth. They had lived long enough within the monarchy to recognize the tone of finality. Their silence was not confusion, it was acceptance. Others, however, struggled. Not because they doubted William, but because accepting the truth meant confronting emotions they had spent years suppressing. Pain that had never fully healed resurfaced, refusing to remain buried any longer. The past and present collided in ways no one had anticipated, reopening wounds that had never truly closed. There were moments when words failed entirely. Moments when the only response was breath held too long, followed by silence that said everything language could not. Some family members delayed responding, not out of indifference, but out of emotional self-preservation. To acknowledge the news fully meant accepting a new reality, and reality carried consequences none of them were ready to face. But eventually, the silence broke. Because silence, no matter how comforting, could not stop what had already begun. Through it all, Catherine remained a quiet constant. She did not attempt to control the emotional storm. She did not try to soften the truth. Instead, she became the point around which stability formed. Her strength was not loud, it was steady. She understood that this moment was not about avoiding pain, but about enduring it together. Family members who spoke with her found reassurance not in her words, but in her certainty. She believed in William. And that belief became something others could hold on to. As the hours passed, something deeper began to emerge. Beneath the grief, beneath the shock, beneath the emotional fracture, there was recognition. Recognition that William had become something more than he had been before that morning. Family members who had once seen him as the future now saw him as the present. They looked to him not for answers, but for direction. Not because he demanded authority, but because he carried truth. And truth, even when painful, has a gravity that cannot be ignored. Old tensions, once buried beneath routine and distance, began to dissolve. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to remind them that tragedy had a way of exposing what truly mattered. Rivalries lost meaning. Disagreements lost urgency. In their place came something quieter, something more fragile, but infinitely more powerful unity born not from agreement, but from shared loss. At the center of it all stood William. He did not ask to become that center. He did not seek it. But the moment had chosen him, and with it came a responsibility that extended far beyond duty. He had become the emotional axis around which the family now turned. His strength gave them permission to remain strong. His vulnerability gave them permission to remain human. And as the family began to absorb the truth, to carry it together in fragile silence, another realization began to form. This was no longer just a private moment. It was the beginning of something the world itself would soon witness. But outside palace walls, the world remained unaware that Prince William was preparing to step forward and change everything with just a few words. There is no rehearsal for becoming the emotional backbone of a monarchy. No script for carrying centuries of expectation while your own heart breaks in silence. And yet, as Prince William stood alone preparing to face the world, he understood something terrifying. This moment would define not just his future, but the future of the crown itself. In the quiet aftermath of the emergency council, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle into him with a weight that could not be escaped. The private grief he carried no longer belonged solely to him. It had become something larger, something symbolic. Because when tragedy strikes within a royal family, it does not remain personal for long. It becomes public inheritance. It becomes history in motion. And William understood with chilling clarity that how he responded now would shape how the monarchy itself would endure what came next. Responsibility had always been part of his identity, but this was different. This was not the gradual assumption of duty. This was the sudden collapse of emotional distance. He could no longer remain protected behind the comfort of preparation. The future had arrived early, uninvited, and it demanded his voice. Every instinct within him wrestled with the same impossible contradiction. He was a grieving son. Yet he was also the institution's shield against uncertainty. He was allowed to feel pain, but he was not allowed to be defined by it. And in that contradiction, his transformation began. Catherine remained at his side, not offering instructions, but offering something far more powerful: presence. She understood that this was not a moment he could be guided through. It was a moment he had to walk through himself. Yet her quiet confidence gave him strength. She reminded him, without saying it, that he was not alone in carrying what felt unbearable. Her belief in him became the emotional foundation he needed to steady himself. Where doubt threatened to take hold, her certainty replaced it. Meanwhile, advisors worked with quiet urgency, finalizing the language that would soon be heard by millions. Every word was weighed carefully, every phrase examined for balance. Tradition demanded restraint. Tradition demanded composure. Tradition demanded distance. But William found himself rejecting those expectations. He understood their purpose, but he also understood their limitations. Distance protected the crown, but it also isolated it. And in a moment defined by loss, isolation was the last thing the monarchy could afford. He realized that the public did not need perfection. They needed truth. That realization reshaped everything. He chose not to hide behind carefully constructed detachment. He chose not to allow the institution to speak for him. Instead, he would speak as himself, not just as the heir, not just as the future king, but as a human being who understood loss in the same way they did. This was not weakness, this was strength of a different kind. A strength rooted not in invulnerability, but in courage, the courage to be seen, even when being seen meant revealing pain. In that moment, William stepped fully into the identity he had been moving toward his entire life. Not through ceremony, not through inheritance, but through choice. Because leadership is not defined by titles, it is defined by moments when retreat is possible, but courage moves forward instead. And William chose forward. What he was about to do would not erase the tragedy. It would not undo the loss, but it would redefine how the monarchy faced it. It would show a different kind of leadership, one built not on distance, but on emotional truth. And when the moment finally came, the world would see not just a prince, but a man forever changed by the words he was about to speak. Millions would remember exactly where they were when Prince William appeared. His expression alone told the story before he ever spoke. This wasn't ceremony. This wasn't tradition. This was grief, barely contained behind royal composure. And as he delivered the tragic news, his voice carried not just information, but the emotional weight of a son, a father, and a future king facing the moment he had always feared. The decision to stand there himself had already broken expectation. For generations, tragedy within the monarchy had been filtered through carefully crafted statements, delivered by officials trained to protect the institution from emotional exposure. But William chose something different. He chose presence. He chose truth. And in doing so, he stripped away the distance that had long separated the crown from the people it served. This was no longer the monarchy speaking. This was William. And the difference was undeniable. For a brief moment, silence surrounded him, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of collective recognition. The world understood, even before the words came, that this was not routine. This was not symbolic, this was final. When he began to speak, there was no theatrical strength in his voice, no artificial performance of control. There was only honesty. And that honesty carried more power than any rehearsed statement ever could. He did not hide behind tradition. He did not conceal the emotional truth of what had been lost. He allowed it to exist openly, without apology. In that moment, millions saw something they had never fully seen before, not just the future king, but the man beneath the title. They saw someone carrying pain, not as weakness, but as responsibility. And that vulnerability did something extraordinary. It dissolved the illusion of emotional invincibility that had long defined royal leadership. It reminded the world that the monarchy was not immune to the same human experiences that shaped everyone else. Loss did not spare bloodlines. It did not respect crowns. It simply arrived, and William faced it without retreat. The reaction was immediate. Messages of shock and sorrow spread faster than anyone could contain them. People who had never stood _toggle within palace walls suddenly felt connected to the weight William carried. Because grief, when shared honestly, becomes something larger than individual suffering. It becomes collective. And in that shared emotional space, something unexpected began to happen. The monarchy, long viewed as distant and unchanging, began to feel human again. Leaders from across the world responded with words of support, but their messages reflected more than diplomatic courtesy. They reflected respect. Respect not only for the tragedy itself, but for the courage William had shown in facing it so openly. Because leadership, in its purest form, is not demonstrated in moments of comfort, it is revealed in moments of vulnerability. and William had revealed himself completely. Inside the palace, the emotional impact was just as profound. Those who had watched him grow from protected heir to emerging leader now saw the final step of that transformation. This was no longer preparation, this was reality. He had crossed the invisible threshold between inheritance and ownership. The crown was no longer something waiting in his future. It was something already shaping his present. And beyond the palace walls, the public began to see him differently. Not as a symbol, but as a person. Not as someone defined solely by destiny, but as someone defined by choice. His willingness to stand before them, to speak without hiding behind institutional distance, reshaped their understanding of what the monarchy could become. It could be strong without being cold. It could endure without losing its humanity. What William had done in that moment could not be undone. He had altered the emotional contract between the crown and the people forever. He had shown that leadership did not require emotional absence. It required emotional courage. But the announcement was not the end, it was only the beginning of a transformation no one could stop. Behind every public moment stood a private one no one else would ever see. And in the quiet aftermath of William's announcement, it was Catherine who became his refuge. While the world watched a prince fulfill his duty, she witnessed the man beneath the crown grieving, exhausted, and forever changed. The weight he had carried so bravely before the world did not disappear once the words were spoken. If anything, it became heavier, because now there was nothing left to prepare for. The truth had been released. The emotional armor he had worn so carefully had served its purpose, and what remained was the human cost beneath it. Away from expectation, away from the unrelenting gaze of public attention, William was left alone with the silence that follows irreversible moments. It was in that silence that Catherine stepped closer, not as a princess, not as a future queen, but as the one person who understood the full depth of what he had lost. She did not offer solutions. She did not attempt to reframe the pain. Instead, she gave him something far more powerful: permission to be vulnerable without fear of consequence. For a man raised to believe that emotional restraint was strength, that permission became a form of healing. In her presence, he did not have to be unbreakable. He did not have to be certain. He could simply be human. And that humanity, long buried beneath years of preparation, began to surface in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their bond, already forged through years of shared responsibility, deepened in ways that transcended royal duty. This was no longer about public roles or institutional expectation. This was about survival, emotional survival. Catherine became the quiet force protecting not just William, but the fragile space around him. She ensured that the outside world could not intrude upon what needed to remain sacred. She shielded their children from the emotional storm, preserving a sense of stability in a moment defined by uncertainty. She understood that grief, if exposed too quickly, could fracture even the strongest foundations. Within the family, something subtle began to shift. The tragedy that had threatened to divide them instead created unexpected unity. Old distances lost their meaning. Familiar tensions faded into the background. Because in the face of shared loss, the illusion of separation became impossible to maintain. They were reminded, painfully but clearly, that beyond titles and hierarchy, they were bound by something far more fragile and far more enduring. William, however, could not escape the exhaustion that followed such profound emotional exposure. For the first time since the emergency meeting began, he allowed himself to feel the full extent of what had been demanded of him. Not just strength, but sacrifice. Not just leadership, but emotional surrender. He had given something of himself that could never be reclaimed. And in doing so, he had crossed into unfamiliar territory where the burden of the crown was no longer theoretical, but deeply personal. Catherine remained constant through it all. Her strength did not diminish. It expanded. She became more than his partner. She became his equilibrium. Together, they formed something the monarchy had rarely allowed itself to embody so openly, a partnership defined not by distance, but by emotional truth. Their unity sent a quiet message, one far more powerful than any formal declaration. The future of the crown would not be carried by one person alone. It would be carried together. Healing did not arrive suddenly. It never does. It arrived slowly, in moments of quiet understanding, in shared silences that required no explanation. William was not the same man he had been before that morning. But he was not broken. He was evolving. And with Catherine beside him, he began to understand that grief did not end strength. It reshaped it. Yet even as the family grieved, the monarchy itself began quietly shifting beneath William's feet. Some moments don't just change lives, they change history. And the emergency meeting at Kensington Palace would become one of those moments. Because in facing unimaginable tragedy, Prince William didn't just deliver devastating news. He crossed an invisible threshold from heir to leader, from protected son to protector of the crown itself. In the days that followed, something within William settled into place, not peace, not relief, but clarity. The uncertainty that had once defined his path was gone. It had been replaced by something heavier, something permanent. He no longer stood at the edge of responsibility, he stood at its center. The transformation was not announced. It did not require ceremony. It revealed itself in the quiet authority he carried, in the way others now looked to him without hesitation. In the way his presence alone seemed to steady the institution around him. He had become what he was always meant to become, but far sooner, and at far greater cost than anyone had expected. The public felt it too. Their perception of him shifted, not because of what he inherited, but because of what he endured. They saw in him not just a symbol of continuity, but a reflection of resilience. His willingness to stand before them in truth without hiding behind tradition created something the monarchy had struggled to achieve for generations: authentic trust. He was no longer distant. He was no longer abstract. He was real. And in that reality, people found connection. They found reassurance. They found belief in a future that suddenly felt uncertain. Catherine's role, once defined by partnership, now expanded into something even more profound. She was no longer simply beside him, she was integral to his strength. Her quiet stability had not only sustained him, it had sustained the crown itself. The public began to see her not only as a future queen, but as a guardian of emotional continuity. Together, they represented something new. Not just leadership, but unity. Not just survival, but evolution. Their bond became a symbol of endurance in the face of loss, proving that the monarchy's greatest strength was not its permanence, but its ability to adapt through those who carried it. Within the family, the fractures that tragedy had exposed began slowly to heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to reshape the emotional structure that held them together. Shared loss created shared understanding. And in that understanding, old divisions lost their power. The monarchy, long defined by hierarchy and distance, began to feel something unfamiliar: closeness. And at the center of that closeness stood William, no longer shielded by inheritance, but strengthened by experience. The crown itself began to evolve under his influence, not through formal change, but through emotional transformation. William had shown that leadership could be both strong and human, That vulnerability did not weaken authority, it deepened it. He had proven that the monarchy's survival depended not on preserving distance, but on embracing connection. This realization would shape every decision that followed. It would redefine what it meant to lead. It would ensure that the future of the crown would not mirror its past, but grow beyond it. His destiny, once something waiting patiently ahead, had accelerated. The timeline had collapsed. The future had arrived uninvited, and William had answered it without retreat. He carried himself differently now, not with the cautious anticipation of someone preparing for responsibility, but with the steady certainty of someone already living it. He had stepped into a role that could never again be separated from who he was. And in doing so, he began to build something larger than legacy. He began to build meaning. History would remember that morning not for the tragedy alone, but for the transformation it created. Because in facing loss openly, William reshaped not only himself, but the institution he was born to protect. He became more than the future king. He became the present foundation upon which that future would stand. And as history quietly recorded that morning, one truth became undeniable. Prince William had stepped into his future not by choice, but by necessity. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.